Okay, welcome everyone. This is the last seminar of this series that we did. It was 2025 and this one 2026. I hope you have all enjoyed all these sessions that we had done. We will keep going with the sessions after CERS, probably, maybe in second term or so, or first term. I don't know. We have to decide that yet. So today we have a special talk. We have Dr. Todd Woodward. He's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia in Canada. He's a research scientist at the Mental Health and Substance Use Services. Also, he's the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience of Schizophrenia Laboratory in the same university and the Brain Dynamics Laboratory. His research is focused on task-based functional brain imaging and fMRI and apply multivariate statistics for study of the overlap between two sets of variables, with this path converging on the study of the overlap between cognition and symptoms in schizophrenia at the levels of brain networks. So today he's going to talk about his research, and he asked especially that if we could make this more interactive. So you're all welcome to ask your questions. And after his presentation, we will still have more time for discussion. So you can start from now, Todd. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Pleasure. It's great to connect with this group. And Maria, can you let me know if there's any questions or comments in the chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming online here to talk about these various aspects of that surround, I guess, language and speech. But mostly, most of my focus is on task-based fMRI. So really, I mean, when we're talking about schizophrenia or symptoms or um, speech perception, mind wandering, all these different concepts, there's so much to go over. And also the methodology that our lab uses is something you might not have heard before. So I don't know whether we want to talk about fMRI methodology or cognition or statistics, but I kind of have slides for all those things. So that's why I kind of want to have a more interactive session. I'm just not very familiar with the group and I'm not sure what people want to talk about. But anyway, I will definitely be focused on fMRI, and hopefully for those of you that use machine learning or using some computational methods that involve input of fMRI, I really want to talk about the optimal way to use fMRI and what types of input might be helpful. So task-based fMRI as opposed to resting state fMRI involves, when people sit in the scanner, they usually are looking at a screen, possibly through a mirror, and we present stimuli at certain time points. And so the real advantage of task-based fMRI is that we can actually take much of the variance in bold signal and separate it out based on what the task timing is, such that we can really simplify a lot of the problems that are usually present with resting state fMRI, getting out, heart rate and breathing. As long as those don't correlate with the timing of the task, we can kind of take them out of the equation at the beginning. So it really simplifies things. And it turns out we've been focusing on this for quite a few years and have recently just published somewhat of an edited book that everyone can download if you're interested in reading sort of a accumulation of the evidence for the replicable aspects of task-based fMRI in a multidimensional type of approach. But anyway, I'll get to that in a second. But I just wanted to show this graph here. So the green line is, let's see it. Okay, so there, my Zoom is covering it. So they have here, this is, I hope I have the citation down here. Oh, it's right at the top. Communications biology. So the green line is what they call activation studies. So traditionally, task-based fMRI was kind of dominant. And this is, the early 1996, very, very early in fMRI. And originally, it was kind of an adaptation of cognitive psychology, such that we gave tasks, and then the studies were done basically univariate analyses, basically correlating an assumed shape of the hemodynamic response with the actual bold signal. And most of the studies early were done in task-based fMRI, but not in a multivariate type of way or looking at connectivity or correlation between different brain areas, but just looking at activation in each area on its own. But then later, what's called functional connectivity started to get more dominant, and that really dominated with resting state fMRI. So you can see here that resting state has become much more commonly used than task-based fMRI, and that usually involves looking at correlations and just parcellating the brain into certain number of parcels and then correlating the different brain activity just when people are resting. And task-based fMRI has kind of taken a bit of a downturn. And although there is some work done with parcellating and correlating with task-based fMRI too. But our approach from the beginning, and that started like around, I think our first paper on this method was published around 2006. And it connects task-based fMRI with connectivity in a different type of way than parcellating and correlating. So anyway, that's been kind of a history of what's happened with this. I'm hoping that task-based fMRI starts to come back a bit. I personally have never published a resting state study or even analyzed any resting state data. For me, it's all been about task-based fMRI. So the reason why some of you, I'm not really sure how many people here are actually doing fMRI or maybe using fMRI as an input into machine learning algorithms, possibly for classifying patients, subtyping patients, precision medicine, that type of work. But we have the garbage in, garbage out idea, such that if we want to have good classification methods or artificial intelligence algorithms, if we put in good data, then we get better at classification. So I just want to introduce you all to the method that we've been using and make an argument that this would add some quality to as an input to artificial intelligence algorithms or large language models or whatever types of processing people do in order to try to advance psychiatry. So this is kind of the big picture. This is Chantal Percival, who's been in my lab for a few years, but now is in medical school. But there is a link to downloading the book that we published last year. It's called Cognitive Modes Detectable with Task-Based fMRI. Cognitive modes we define as very, very reliable patterns that are replicable over many tasks, and also a function associated with each pattern, a cognitive function. And the evidence for the cognitive function is based on how the brain activity changes under a whole range of different task conditions. And so we can see here that we have actually 11 very reliable patterns that replicate across all the tasks that we've analyzed anyway. And the complicated thing, or maybe the um, sometimes counterintuitive um, reason for the title of my talk has to do with the fact that a number of these cognitive modes actually touch upon aspects of cognition that can be considered language. There is one called language, and this one has Broca's and Wernicke's area here, so basically Broca and Wernicke's area on that network. But there's also other networks that involve language type processes, like this one called maintaining internal attention could be interpreted as inner speech. And that has very different pattern of activity than the actual language network. This reevaluation network involves thinking back to what a person has just done and wondering whether it needs to be revised or changed or whether they did it correctly. Auditory perception is actually active when people are hearing speech, and the language network is more active when people are actually processing type of linguistic information. So, what is the evidence for all of these words? That's the main thing. And again, if anybody wants to ask questions about different aspects of this, I can jump around in the talk. But I was just going to show you the evidence for the reason we use these words and the interpretation of what the function of these different cognitive modes are. So again, in this book we have 11 cognitive modes are described in great detail and how they replicate over a range of different tasks. as well as there are a number of other chapters that kind of talk about the methodology and the philosophy behind it. So encourage you to download that and we can talk about it anytime. So here's just the really most basic idea statistics wise. So we have the fMRI signal here. So this is, I'm not going to go into detail unless people want to talk about it, but basically all the TRs are down the rows here and all of the subjects are stacked one on top of the other. So here's all with all the voxels around the columns here. This is basically all the fMRI data from task-based fMRI after pre-processing. And then we use a model of the task timing to separate this fMRI signal to that which is predictable from task-related variance, or in other words, which is predictable from the task timing, and this is just residual that's not predictable from task timing. So usually around 5 to 15% of the total fMRI variance is predictable from a model of the task timing, and what's left over is like 85 to 95% of the variance. So we're doing a principal component analysis on only the task related variance. So just using equation little y equals y hat plus e, and so you may remember, what linear equations, the between relationship between an x and a y variable. We have that part of y which is predictable from x. That's y hat, and that's in this matrix. And this is not predictable, a variance in y that is not predictable from x. So we basically split y into, say, around 250,000 y hats and 250,000 errors, and then focus completely on this section of the data. So basically, we have a multidimensional analysis method here that isolates task-related variance prior to extraction of components, which the components have spatial information and temporal information, and also functional interpretation. We don't parcellate, but we include all available brain areas that the smallest possible regions, which are usually called voxels. And then we have data-driven exploration. This I'll hopefully get to, but we don't assume hemodynamic response shape. We use a finite Boltzmann response model to actually allow the data to show us what the bold changes are associated with each task. So if you're not interested in statistics or methodology, you're safe to completely ignore that. If you are, I can talk about it in more detail if you ask. But let me just start with language. So we have one of the chapters in the book is on language or on the language network. So this is the language network that we put forward in the book that emerges from this dimensional type of analysis. And so we have Broca's and Wernicke's area, basically, or at least the fMRI version is here on this slice, and also here on this slice. So those are the same clusters here. And this is Lipkin, so the Fedorenko group put forward a template that they call a language template on 608 subjects. So this is just a direct comparison of our dimensional method, and their method involves differencing. So we have a control condition, an experimental condition, or a condition with more language involvement, or words versus non-words, or speech versus non-speech, and they have a difference of a match to an assumed model. So this is sort of end up with similar areas, but very different methodology. But we have cerebellar activity here, and we have the Broca's and Wernicke's area here, and then we have more parietal and occipital activity than they do. There's, overlap in the important areas, but the differences between the methodology may explain differences in this anatomy. But I'll just talk a little about this type of pattern that emerges from an analysis of a task. This was a language type of task that we're going to call semantic association here. So much of what we'll do here is we'll do an analysis of the bold signal based on a particular task, but that bold signal will be first separated into task timing predictable variance, and secondly, a dimensional analysis will be carried out such that we'll be able to identify different anatomical and temporal dimensions in the data. So for this task, this has been published in 2016 on a sample with schizophrenia, but we reanalyzed it for the book because in the book we don't have any, even though many of our tasks were published studying schizophrenia. In the book, we reanalyzed everything with only healthy control so that we could have more of a putting forward, the healthy brain and what the dimensions are that fMRI can detect. So in this case, a person will say, which of these three words is most associated with the word above? So they see the word archer and they have to choose one of these that's most associated. So they would choose arrow. And then a bit later, they would have the same type. Oh, I guess they don't repeat the prompt, but this one, fox and hen, are related but more distantly related than archer and arrow. So we only have two conditions. The condition when we have closely related words, and it's fairly easy choice, and then a more difficult type of choice. And so two of the modes that are elicited during this task, one is the language, but the other one's called maintaining internal attention. So basically we have linguistic processing here in these patterns, and inner speech is one way to look at it, but focusing on internal representations. And it's really hard to come up with words that everyone agree with. And of course, we're always working on changing those words and making them more precise. But you can see anatomically these are quite different, even though I'm not showing the same slices here. If I did, you'd see that these particular patterns are not present in this maintaining internal attention mode. But we're seeing kind of more inferior areas in the language network and more superior areas in the maintaining internal attention network. So we're more used to looking at these anatomical depictions. And you may say, oh, those look very similar. And of course, for many, many years, we looked at these images and it took a long time to kind of distinguish the specific patterns, and they are very reliable and very specific. But the more difficult part, I mean, this did take a long time, but the more difficult part was to actually determine what the difference is between the function of these two. So for this particular task, both of these spatial patterns emerge in different components. But the most interesting aspect of comparing these cognitive modes for this task is to actually look at the bold changes that are induced by each one of these, or that are associated by with each one of these two patterns. So in the language mode, we see that the distantly related pairs have much more activity than the closely related pairs, which would be expected for a network that's involved in linguistic processing. So this is just visual processing of linguistic information. But the other mode has the exact opposite pattern. So there's actually more activity for closely related pairs than distantly related pairs. So you see a type of dissociation here. We can think of the anatomical distinctions as something like a dissociation, but when we're looking at the bold changes, we really do see a very stark dissociation such that they're the complete opposite direction. So how could we have more activity in maintaining internal attention or inner speech for closely related relative to distantly related words? And the answer to that question depends, well, we can try to interpret just this one task, but what we do in the book is compare across many, many tasks to try to come up with an interpretation that fits all, because we see the same anatomical patterns in many tasks. So when we can compare the activity, the bold signal changes over many tasks, then we can come up with an interpretation. And this one, our hypothesis for future research is that the closely related words induce more type of imagery or some type of reflection, since the image, presumably, that comes to mind for bow and arrow or archer arrow might be more intense than the more distantly related, where people might be struggling to come up with an association. That struggling activates the language network, but when the association has been made, apparently, the internal attention network is more active, so we have to come up with an interpretation, and ours is just having that imagery and focusing on that internal representation of that. So that's the process that we go through. No one's had any comments or questions yet, as far as I know, so I'll just continue. So let me just talk about this Human Connectome project task. Well, this task was originally developed by Frith in the 2000s, and in 2013, Barch and colleagues put this forward as one of the tasks that's available in the Human Connectome project, so that we can download this task and analyze it, which is what we did. And I think you can actually find, sorry, in the Human Connectome project, we can find this article that actually just gives us this image from the Human Connectome project for this task. So they're saying if you're interested in this task, look, here's the brain areas that are active when we compare a situation where, well, actually, let me go through this. So what happens is there's a little, if you don't not familiar with this, I'll just take a second to describe it. It's actually a little animation. I don't have the animation here, but I just have this series, like what happens first, A, B, C, D, E. So first there's a little triangle and or little triangle and a large triangle here. Kind of the large triangle is maybe moving in this direction, little triangle is doing random things. Then the big triangle sort of grabs the little triangle. This is the mentalization. So we have to start to realize, oh, the big triangle wants the little triangle to come out of the square. Doesn't, but the little triangle doesn't want to come out. So the big triangle kind of goes into the square, pushes the little triangle out and comes out and then sort of keeps it out there. So we impose a mental state on the two triangles and most, I guess, on the larger triangle to say that, okay, this is, a parent trying to push the child out or whatever we want to think that that might involve compared to a condition where there's just random movement of the shapes. So when we go to the Human Connectome project, they give us this image and say, here's the difference between mentalizing and the control condition. And so we could use this type of activation map and throw that into machine learning or whatever we want to use for trying to predict treatment outcomes or trying to associate with symptoms. But I think we can get better quality type of data from fMRI than just this difference image. So Ava Momeni, PhD student in my lab, just yesterday published this paper on PsycArchives, and we're submitting it now to, I think, Journal of Neuroimaging. And so she has two samples. We actually split a sample of 1,000 randomly into two different samples and found basically an exact replication between the two samples. So we've pre-published one of them, and then we'll cite that one when we submit second paper to show that it can replicate very well, and everyone can go and see the other sample analyzed. So this involves, like I just said, watching this 20-second animation, and then people have to indicate for 3 seconds whether there was a social interaction or no interaction or not sure. So basically, we're looking at 23 seconds worth of time. And this is just sort of showing how the different blocks and fixations took place. So what we found is actually 6 dimensions and 6 cognitive modes. They all have their own distinct shapes in them, and these shapes are described in great detail in the book, along with, some sort of nicknames we have for these shapes and little doodles that help us remember what the shapes are. I don't have these in the talk because sometimes they don't look very professional, and I don't really care that much, but I don't want to embarrass my students or other colleagues that are with me here. So you can see them in the book, but here we have them outlined, and you can decide for yourself what patterns they'll look like. But anyway, so how do we determine what these different networks are, these different patterns, what types of cognitive processes they're associated with? And the answer has to do with looking at the bold signal changes. Because each set of patterns is attached to their own distinct bold signal change. We study this. And so one of these reliable patterns and a reliable cognitive function is, we call that a cognitive mode. So I'll go in a little more detail, but these actually correspond with these 6 patterns. And so you can see that there's very, very different type of patterns over time. So this is about 32 seconds worth of time. So when we have a task that's okay, we have 23, 25, about 25 seconds. The bold signal, we have to look a bit longer because we probably know, everyone probably knows that the bold signal takes quite a long time to say, if we have even a, 30, 50, and 100 millisecond type of cognitive event, we'll have to study the bold signal for probably at least 10 or 15 seconds to see it increase, peak, and go back to baseline. And so we can see that some of the cognitive modes activate mostly in the middle of the trial. Some activate at the beginning and the end of the trial, and some have a different type of pattern. So we can really determine a lot about the function of these cognitive modes by comparing the activity over time to the task diagram so that we can understand how that task and that timing of that task ended up producing changes in the bold signal that are associated with each pattern. So we don't have any a priori assumptions. There's no networks put into the model. There's no anatomical restrictions. There are no assumed bold changes whatsoever. We just use a finite impulse response model. If you know what that is, great. If not, I probably won't have time to explain it today, but we can always talk about it anytime. Or Abhijit Chinchani, who's in the group, and I published something in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience forum that goes in great detail about why assuming a bold signal change and correlating with it probably is slowing um, science in terms of cognitive neuroscience. And because we can actually observe the bold changes and interpret them. Like, for example, this language network in this task, even though there isn't much processing of linguistic information in this task, we actually see activity in this configuration. So we can see that this anatomical pattern, Broca's and Wernicke's area, or at least the fMRI version of it, does emerge from this task, but there's more activity in the mentalizing condition than in the random condition. And so there isn't really, people are looking at those two triangles and watching them perform what is in the mentalizing condition, some type of social interaction, but that activates the language network. So, and in other tasks, we've found the language network actually activates in conditions of non-verbal communication as well. So it may be that this particular configuration, at least the way the bold signal configures, is also present for nonverbal communication as well as linguistic processing. But again, in the language chapter in the book, we go through I think 6 or 7 different tasks and show how that network activates or even gets suppressed during certain conditions. It's just so much to explain, and nobody's asking questions. I'm not really sure what people want to talk about, so I'm just going to continue with this task. Here's the default mode network. Default mode network deactivates for almost every task except tasks that involve autobiographical um, memory or imagining the future, imagining the past. And in this case, even though it does deactivate at the beginning, so when people are carrying out a difficult task, the default mode network deactivates, but it actually activates in this case something to do with theory of mind or and we call it here mental projection into social narratives. So it actually goes above zero, so it ends up activating higher in the mentalizing condition in the random condition. So this just provides more evidence about the default mode network. So sometimes mind wandering or imagining the past or future, that could be considered uh, language type of task, but it actually ends up involving the default mode network, although the language network would also be involved. But notice that there's a real dissociation here between the language network during the mid part of the trial and the default mode network, which deactivates in this case. But by the time they've actually determined what the function is and are responding, yes, I saw a social interaction, we're seeing the default mode actually turn from deactivation. These are blue, so this is negative loading. So this is actually uh, deactivation, and then this turns into activation here. Actually, that I guess is backwards, but this should be, I guess, not negative loadings. These are positive loadings. I guess we have it in blue, but the fact is it becomes active at the end as deactive at the beginning. So we can go through all of these. Multiple demand network ends up being higher in the mentalizing condition than the random condition. And this reevaluation network is interesting because every other condition has mentalizing higher than the random condition, except this one reevaluation. We think that the reevaluation network, like I mentioned before, occurs when people or activates when people are thinking, what did I do wrong there? Maybe I should change that. This is the network that ends up being deactive in people with schizophrenia and with delusions. And we know that people with delusions have difficulty integrating evidence against a belief, and that extends beyond their delusion to other types of um, situations where things don't seem as they appear at first. They are less willing to upgrade or update their beliefs. And then here, this network is more active in random. So we think that during the random condition, people are doubting themselves and thinking, oh, maybe I didn't quite see an interaction and checking more carefully and getting concerned that maybe they're missing it. And so that's why this is a different pattern than all of the other ones. So anyway, this is the process of determining what cognitive modes, how to describe them anatomically, and also how to describe them in terms of function. So And this is just a little animation showing. Oh, that doesn't actually work. Just showing that over time, um, a particular spatial configuration uh, has this type of bold change over the whole time series of the task. So obviously that's only one of the anatomical configuration has this pattern, but usually there's five or six within every task. So you can see that there'd be a whole range of different types of bold signal changes that could be used as input for any type of algorithm. So what I'm suggesting here is that, and sort of, hopefully, probably many of you haven't heard about this type of methodology that we use, even though we have published 30 or so papers on it. It just hasn't really been a popular way of carrying out brain imaging. So this is what the Human Connectome Project puts forward as what might be interesting for us in terms of classifying subtyping patients. Using precision medicine. But I bring your attention again to garbage in, garbage out. If we want to have good classification methods, would you rather put in this image or all of this more detailed information? I think there's a lot more information in task-based fMRI we can have because this pattern, that's the difference between the mental condition, which is the blue line, and the control condition, which is the red line. This is basically a difference of any matches of the bold signal change, assumed bold signal change that happen to conform. So we have an assumed bold signal change for condition A, an assumed bold signal change for condition B. We difference them, we get this map. But we can see from this that within there is actually six different dimensions that that have their own anatomical and temporal configurations. So we can really unpack this one little image into multiple dimensions and a time series associated with each, which could be used to classify patients in our algorithms that we want to move forward with. So I'm hoping that anyone here who's doing that type of work would be interested in trying to extract more information from the data that you have in order to have more accurate models of, could turn out to be clinically useful. So still no discussion, still no questions.
I
So
have
I
a
will just,
question.
yep, Gina, yes. Hi.
Hi. I'm so sorry I came in a little bit late. Um, but sorry. I was going to ask about function. It looks like you're about to talk about that. I just wondered whether you had a sort of working model. I mean, it seems to me that what you're capitalizing on, as I understand it, you're not assuming a particular shape to the hemodynamic response, and you're just sort of modeling the actual time courses there are. And it seems to me that what you're actually picking up is in sort of multiple events that are being kind of convolved, and all these different patterns are picking up on some kind of temporal resolution, at least the cognitive level, with
Yeah.
and it seems to me that you could then make a story of like cognitively what the order and
Yeah,
what the order of the underlying cognitive events are that the Bolt signal is picking up on. You know, if it's going up
exactly.
and down, presumably, you know, there's an initiator, and then that.
Yep.
I'm just wondering. I, if you're going to talk about that, then I guess my question is moot.
Well, your question is excellent. And what we've actually ended up doing is trying to classify the types of cognitive processes that are producing these spatial configurations. And we've done that by interpreting the bold signal changes across different conditions across many, many tasks, right? And what you're suggesting is moving beyond that and actually trying to line all of that theorizing up with cognitive concepts that are already available. And the task of actually saying what we're actually making a strong statement about is the types of cognitive processes that fMRI can detect. That's what we're trying to determine here. But whether or not those actually map onto the cognitive processes that are of interest to cognitive psychology
Right. Well,
is no.
I mean,
Go
if you're
ahead.
making a claim that fMRI is picking up on separable cognitive processes, then even though, I mean, presumably if you had the underlying events, if you knew, the actual underlying events, then you would be able to then come up, if you were able to simulate those underlying events, you would be able to come up with bold signals that look something like
Yeah,
those that are mirrored in these different
I'd love
networks.
to do
So you
that.
might
I'd love
have
to do
one
that.
going up and then it might go into latent mode. But I don't know what you were talking about, things like reevaluation, um, uh, top-down control, allocation of attentional resources, keeping something in working memory and then reactivating it. All of this is very reminiscent of a lot of different cognitive theories. And I guess I was asking whether you've tried to, links. I mean, I guess I'm believing you. I'm saying, yes, you are picking up on something that's real, and these are really interesting kind of patterns. And I guess if you believe that, then why not link it to actual known cognitive processes that have been detected with not just cognitive theory, but neural measures with better temporal resolution?
Why not indeed? And not that I don't want to. But for example, you say reevaluation, right? You say thinking, did I do that correctly or not? And you say that that links with, I think you said working memory. Did you?
So, okay, so I mean, like metacognitive control, for example. So, for example, we know that a lot of some of those frontal midline regions that you're showing here are very much involved with tracking confidence, and that acts as a top-down control signal to figure out monitoring, I guess, and basically a top-down control signal that is determining how much you process stuff in lower level networks like the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, which you're showing here. And those, there are theories sort of discussing that, those are happening in parallel, but with slightly different time courses. And I know maybe
Yeah.
I'm going a
No,
bit crazy here, but it's
no, no.
largely
What you're
consistent
talking
with a
about
lot of
basically,
theory.
I'd be happy to talk about that for the rest of the hour. That's of great interest to me, but it takes time, because there's a lot of concepts being thrown around in
Uh,
this type of discussion, and every single one of them can be broken down and discussed about evidence for, because what I wanted to just talk about, if you want, we want to talk about, say, keeping something in mind, right? Like if we say reevaluation, so I mean, let's just talk some more about it. Hopefully everyone's okay with it. But if we say
I don't
reevaluation,
want to derail the discussion.
well, I really want to talk about this. So unless someone interrupts us, I would like to continue with it, because basically I just want to talk about what people are interested in, and you sound like I'm really interested too. So I just want to make the point that the reevaluation network, it looks familiar to you probably. It's a frontal type of network. And then we say, well, that involves thinking back, like in that in particular situation, we see in the random condition, it's more active than the mental condition. So we think that people are thinking back and thinking, oh, did I miss something? Checking themselves, right? So then you say,
Yeah.
well, that involves internal monitoring. And you can say a bunch of other things too. It involves
No,
attention
I
control.
used to hate the word internal monitoring until I got into actually computational mechanisms of it. So
Right.
monitoring means anything and everything, but the way I sort of think about it is monitoring is sort of umbrella term used to refer to a lot of different processes. But recently, and I think this is relevant, and I'm playing here, and I really don't want to derail the conversation, but I didn't think that, I'm sort of surprised by this data because I do think that they align with some of those models. And some of those models basically assume a sort of hierarchical decision-making system in which higher levels of the cortical or some representational hierarchy are monitoring your belief and confidence in what you have perceived. And that when you're uncertain about what you've perceived, then that will actually lead to a reallocation of resources that allows you to reprocess literally what you're talking about, but you're talking about it in more general terms. But I think it's the same as what you're talking about in terms of reallocating resources to lower levels of the hierarchy, like the visual cortex, to become more confident in what you have perceived, and that those things are going hand in hand. And so, what you're right, what was very hand wavy in terms of cognitive control, confidence, cognitive control and monitoring I think now some people, especially in sort of more computational people, um, Peter Diane, Nathaniel Doyle, those kind of people, are, I think they, you can they are trying to assign different brain networks to those different types of monitoring. In other words, this coordinated system. And I
Well,
just have a hunch that what you're showing here is very much in keeping with that literature.
I just want to make a point, okay, about what you're saying. Now, the point is that when we use those words, and it doesn't matter what word it is, because the thing is, when we have these discussions, we can easily get derailed talking about a word, like talking about
I
monitoring, talking about
agree. I
top down.
agree.
Okay. But I don't want to talk about that. What I want to say is that if we say, I'm going to uh, reevaluate my thought process here about, and then that, of course, cues for you a whole bunch of words, right? A whole bunch of words that other people put forward as theories and things like that. But the point that I want to make is that when we say paying attention to internal reception monitoring, something like that, and we say the reevaluation networks are already showed, the thing is that we have done many, many studies on, for example, and not just these ones, but there have been some Sternberg tasks where we just remember some numbers for a short period of time. The reevaluation network specifically does not emerge in those tasks. But what does emerge is this particular network here.
Which one?
And this particular network. So let's not go into it because we will end up talking because so if the reevaluation does not emerge for that, so then we look, okay, this is the pattern that emerges in that type of task. This is the internal attention, internal monitoring. So then what type of cognitive processes is different between the Sternberg task and the social task, that one that we talked about. And so what we see in the reevaluation network, we can talk all we want about it being monitoring and being top down to being like, oh, it's some areas, it's the midline areas that are telling us to, the lower processes, the cue that maybe we should change that. But then we say, well, what about for Sternberg task? What about for just paying attention to internal representations for a short period of time, but not thinking, what did I just do? Well, it doesn't activate. That pattern's not there. And
It just
so we
seems that
can
those are
compare
different,
across
very
all.
different tasks. I mean, in one of
But,
them,
but
there's a lot of lack of I know, but I mean, I guess, I mean, okay, I mean, since we're going that, I really sympathize with the use of terminology in cognitive neuroscience, and it is, and I used to hate using the word monitoring because you're right, it has become to mean and things like executive function, cognitive control. I actually feel the same way as multiple demand network, and for all the reasons that you sort of say, even language network, I find very contradictory, But what helps is, actual computational models, which force to, you can map them back on to to classic cognitive constructs. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, I don't think of, for example, a reevaluation as necessarily tied up with visual processing or auditory processing. And there is going to be a different type of reevaluation if you're actually reevaluating what you've just perceived from the external world than if you're reevaluating thoughts within memory. But what I am saying is that once you actually make commitments about what you're reevaluating and where it's coming from, then it may be a useful exercise to map some of what you're seeing, which seems super interesting to me, onto some of those more computational constructs. And then later you can then go back to the rest of the literature and think, oh, that's what those guys meant by monitoring. And you're right, that what those people were talking about monitoring is something different. It's more of a proactive kind of monitoring. So, I mean, I totally get what you're saying about the terminology in the classic cognitive science literature, and which is why I stayed clear of it for so long. But lately, I've kind of been looking through it for a different lens, and it just seemed to me, and that some of what you're showing could be looked through that lens?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, and I would love to do that. Right now, we're focusing on
I'm going to shut up
basically
now because
evidence
yeah. And I
from
think
the
the
bold
evidence
signal
is
changes.
fantastic. Yeah.
And the evidence that we have accumulated and put into that book should be modeled. But I'm not talking about modeling today. I'm just talking about what types of cognitive processes I can give a lot of evidence for that fMRI can detect.
Makes a lot
This
of
is what
sense.
fMRI can detect and is very, very reliable, and it's very interpretable. And the next step would be to model it.
And
But I
what's
don't
the
want,
book?
hmm?
I'm
The
really
book?
sorry. I
Oh,
missed
sorry, you
what's
weren't
the
here, I
book?
guess, at the beginning.
I'm
There,
sorry.
this is Chantal Percival, my student who's not with the lab. She's now a medical student, but you can download the book here and all the evidence for how all of these different spatial patterns activate under like 28 different tasks, not for every one of them, but for each one of the patterns, we can study the bold signal changes over, say, 7, 8 different tasks, and we can come up with a cognitive process that fMRI can detect. But we don't know how that cognitive process would map onto the types of cognitive concepts that cognitive psychology studies and models.
Okay.
So we're just telling you what we know for sure with great reliability fMRI can detect and what type of cognitive process that is. Now, we don't know for sure whether or not the phonological loop or any type of other cognitive process that has come down in the literature in cognitive psychology or cognitive neuropsychology.
Oui.
Martin? Is Martin
Ah,
talking?
et l'enseigne prévaut, je te dirais, là, dans...
Anyway, yes, so the mapping of these concepts to cognitive psychology is still open but it's what I would love to do. But it's interesting because the field of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuropsychology has advanced and now is turning into modeling, over many, many
Yeah,
years.
I would not. I agree with you what you're saying about classic cognitive neuropsychology. I agree it doesn't map it very well onto those things.
Well, it's a process to determine how it does. But anyway, we have here evidence from fMRI only, not not trying to even study the phonological loop
I
or
think
any
it's
other
super
psychology
interesting.
concept, but just allowing the data to tell us how those configurations change over based on certain tasks, and using that information to determine what those cognitive processes are that fMRI can detect. So now
And
it's
in all
sort of
cases, you're using an FIR response. You're not assuming any shape. It's
That's
purely
right.
data driven.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't have now I would love to just talk more because going over all this is all the evidence that's presented in the book. This is for example, I'll just gloss over it so we can have time to talk. But here's a spatial pattern, and we can take or leave these little diagrams. And here's just evidence for, different types of tasks where it activates and how we interpret different changes in the experimental design based on the bold signal patterns and how that helps us understand the cognitive processes that fMRI can detect, and modeling and mapping those to cognitive psychology and cognitive neuropsychology concepts are a future goal that are of great interest. But that's not the evidence we have here because we don't really know what cognitive processes are true. But we do know what types of cognitive processes we can theorize what types of cognitive processes map across all of these different tasks. Here we have this one pattern activating a one, two, three, four tasks that I'm presenting here, but in fact, in the book, there's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, or seven different tasks. So problem is, Gina and I just talked for 15 minutes just about the words. So if I want to explain to you or present to you the evidence for how the different activations across all these tasks help us determine what the cognitive processes that F is that produces this particular pattern, I just don't have time. And you have to read the book, but even that, who wants to go through and look at 7 different task diagrams and interpret all these bold changes? I encourage you to, and my students all do, but I have a feeling that it's kind of more than people are ready to dive into because most of the time people, look at this. One brain,
No,
one
you
brain
have
image.
my full sympathy.
Instead, I'm saying, oh, we actually, from that one image, we shouldn't be looking at that. We should be looking at these six patterns, and these six patterns are bold changes. But people, like, who has time, right? I would just rather look at the brain picture. So I think this is the challenge we're coming up against here, and the challenge why I bet you that no one except my own students has actually looked through that whole book, and maybe they haven't even. But anyway, I don't have time to talk about all this because all this is just more sort of, we're supposed to be talking about language, so just more, evidence for making a distinction, for example, between reevaluative thinking and internal attention. Those are words, the words just are a trap, and it just leads to a whole bunch of discussion. But Lena has a question, and sorry, Lena, but sorry, anyone else that also has a question, but I see Lena. How are you doing, Lena? Good to
I'm
see you.
fine, Todd. I'll let you finish. I don't want to take all of your
No,
time.
no, forget it. Okay, I'll just show. There's some statistics and some math. Oh boy, all this concept. This is for people that are interested in the fur model, but I don't really have time to talk about it. But here's Abhijit here, who's now in Lena's lab. He and Eva Ferrados and I put into the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience discussion forum that very clearly, I think, describes why a finite impulse response model is really going to help the field move forward. And assuming that bold signal change is really hurtful for us. And I'm explaining all that. Didn't have time for a model reevaluation. Okay, that's pretty much the end. So
Well,
go ahead, Lena. It's
for
more
what
fun
it
to
was,
talk
I think it's
anyway.
great.
Thanks, Gina.
Thank you, Todd. Really great. I think one of the things that you're clearly emphasizing to all of us here is there is more than standard GLM approaches for fMRI network analysis, and the CPCA method is a good and clear and well-validated alternative, and rejects the standard hemodynamic response model, which is pretty problematic.
Yeah.
And
Thanks, Lena.
so
As usual, with a clear thinking person who puts forward my message,
this
which
is this
probably
is
got
very
lost
helpful.
in all of my discussions about bold signal change.
I have two questions, and I think you alluded to that in your book with Charles Percival. But I want to know how you think about solving this. One is the reverse inference problem that Gina highlighted. There are theories that are not matched to cognitive modes. How could we go forward solving it? That's one
Okay, let's
question.
talk. Can we talk about that
Yeah,
before
and
your second question?
second question is very simple. Are these cognitive modes replicable across disorders like schizophrenia, like conditions that we are studying?
Yeah, the second question's easy because it's just yes.
Okay.
This, in my opinion, if we do the analysis this way, if we don't make assumptions about the hemodynamic response, if we don't parcellate, if we don't assume any network patterns prior to doing analysis, which is what we do, all of the patterns that I showed you that replicate are not based on any assumptions whatsoever. They're just based on a principal component analysis of the task timing predictable bold signal. That's it. And so they do replicate across all disorders that I've looked into. Of course, there could be the only time I didn't see them emerge was when I looked to analyze a sample of stroke patients who had all different types of brain damage, and the patterns just were, I guess, unique to each individual person. So what we saw was we sort of merged together the people with stroke and the healthy and the people without, and then the networks emerged. But then the people with stroke just had kind of a flat bold change. So they didn't really fit any of those. And so you'd have to look at each individual person to find out what their particular networks look like. But per schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, it emerges and we can study the differences between the groups or between symptom clusters by looking at the bold changes. And sometimes there's more activity in the bold changes, sometimes there's less, depends on the task, depends on the mode. So it's a complicated type of operation. And that's why I didn't talk at all today about symptoms, because I can tell you that all of this that we put forward in that book last year is very, very reliable. But the differences between, symptom groups and the differences even between patient and control, it just takes much more time to determine what's reliable and what's not and what replicates because of the, problems with clinical samples and getting the data and, but it's very easy now to download multiple different tasks and to, compare across different tasks. So anyway, your first question about reverse inference is kind of the point of the whole operation. So reverse inference problem can be solved, I think. And so, the problem is when you read Poljak's articles, kind of comes down to what we need, according to him, is we need to have, 100% association between a spatial map and a function. If we had that, we wouldn't have a reverse inference problem. The problem is that if you see the anterior cingulate activation, that can be tied to any task you give. So now you have a reverse inference problem because every time you see cingulate, you just say it's, stroop, or you say it's conflict, or you say it's pain, or you say it's whatever thing you're studying, right? But if we can actually find not just one brain area, but a whole pattern, which is what we're showing here, that replicates across, we can show that replicates across 7 or 8 tasks. But presumably, if we all were doing this, we would be able to come up with hundreds of tasks. So if we have the same pattern replicating on every one of these tasks, then the reverse inference challenge just becomes, can we come up with a word that describes something across all of these tasks? Or is there some general type of concept that ties to that pattern that no matter what the task is, it's there? So how can we do that after, say, like each chapter in that book, 7 to 8 tasks? We can't really be that confident, but it's way better than sort of like one area and that activates in 30 different tasks, and then we say 30 different things about it. Because what we're trying to do is show that if this pattern replicates over 10, 12, 20 different tasks, our challenge is to reverse infer a general type of cognitive process that we can say fMRI detects. We can say that when we have people think this way in the fMRI scanner, and we know when they do it, we can know what pattern it's going to be in advance. So now, before we actually even download any publicly available data, we actually publish a set of hypotheses that we say which patterns are going to emerge, not only which patterns, but actually which bold changes will be there under the different task conditions. So I think that we're at the point where it's reverse inference because we're saying, here's the pattern. And in this task, this is going to be the cognitive process that I put forward that people are going to engage in because of that task. And this is a bold signal change that will be there. So I'm very confident that we can actually predict before even downloading data what those things are. So the reverse inference problem, I think, comes down to what Poldrack has, as Poldrack said, if we could have 100% correspondence between a brain pattern and a cognitive process, we don't have a reverse inference problem. It's gone. And he even says that. And the problem is he thinks you could never have 100%. That's why he's, tried to split all of the cognitive processes into tinier, more, precise type of processes that would match up with the brain area better, or maybe with the network. But when you do it this way and you just say, here's the pattern it replicates, we can make a more general type of cognitive process that's fMRI specific that is actually 100%. Believe it or not, I know it sounds impossible, but I'm putting forward the evidence that I actually think that we do have basically 100% correspondence between pattern and cognitive processes. Now we have 1 minute left.
Well, thank you very much, Todd, for this wonderful presentation. Yeah, we still have a minute or two. We can wait a bit more I don't know, if someone else has any other questions.
Well, I do have another question.
Go ahead.
So you're committing to these labels, right? You said
No, I'm not committing to the labels.
But in some ways you have to, Todd, because you've just given them labels.
No, not gonna do it.
Network. You've called it this network. You've called it this network. So what
Okay.
makes you come up with those labels?
You're asking me that question.
I'm
I'm
asking you that
glad.
question. Because of course,
Okay.
of course, the very first thing which drives me crazy about multiple demand language network is you're saying, look, the multiple, I realize it's inherently semantically difficult,
Yeah.
but it's it's so self-contradictory when you think of it. It's the language network, and look, it's involved in a non-language.
Completely. Gina, okay, let me answer. I'm not calling it the language network because I think that's a good word. I'm only calling it that because Fedorenko already called it that. And I don't want to come up with a new word because it's the same configuration. So I'm using her word, but I don't like the word Gina. That's what I want to say. I don't think that's a great word.
Why not label it?
No, let me make the point. What I want everyone to do is look through the evidence for what that configuration that Fedorenko calls the language network. I want people look through the evidence of the bold signal changes and try to determine what the cognitive process is that fMRI is picking up. That's why I put that evidence forward in that book. I don't like the word. I'm not promoting the word. I don't care about the word, and I don't care if it changes.
That was my question.
It would be better if everyone come up with their own word, or we could just talk,
they should
the
come
bold
up with
signal changes. I'd rather talk about
a
that.
non-functional word. they should describe the regions. I mean,
I
there has
wouldn't
to be another,
care.
because by imposing those words, you're basically assigning a cognitive function to it before you've even started, which is why I agree with you. It's really misleading.
It's an emerging process that everybody should have. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the word, and I'm not an advocate of the word. Multiple demand, you think I like that word? No, I
Yeah,
only
but
have
Ed
to
did
say it because
a
I don't want to
service to the
confuse
field by
everybody.
putting those names out there. And I will tell you that I mean, very few people in language, apart from, I mean, don't get me wrong, Ed has done beautiful, very careful work, but I don't like the labeling of any network by a task, or by the assumption of what a task index is. And I think I'm definitely not in neurobiology. I'm definitely not the only one who thinks so.
I
So what I'm
agree.
saying is that there's
I'd hate
different,
to be lumped in with people that like those words because that's why I put forward all the evidence so people can make up their own word, and I
yeah,
don't
no,
care about the words.
I really love your evidence. I have to be incredibly rude. I actually have to go because I just realized I got another meeting. You heard that call. And I mean, sorry for barge. Anyway, I just want to say I really like your evidence, and maybe I and my students will, apart from your students, will look at your book. So thank you.
That'd be wonderful. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Okay, do we have any other questions in the audience? Any other comments? Okay, so thank you very much, Todd. This was very good. We really enjoy it, and we really hope to see you more in our seminars. Thanks everyone for participating, and I hope that we can see you all in our meeting in Pavia this 2026. After Sears, we're going to make this other like small satellite meeting, and I really hope that we can all meet there. And yeah, have a very nice weekend. Thank you all for being here.